So welcome back after this quick lunch break. I see the panelists are coming in. Yes, so this is session 2B on megatrends and the future of sustainability and resilience in GVCs. So we will have 3 presentations, and the format will be 15 minutes of presentation, 5 minutes discussion, and 5 minutes for general questions. So we will be starting with Stephanie Kunkel from the IASS in Potsdam.
Thanks.
And I think to not lose further time, we will start right with you, Stephanie. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just see how I can set up the screen. Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. I am Stephanie Kunkel, as Sylvian rightly said. I come from the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, and we have a research group there on digitalization and sustainability transformations. We're specifically interested in the opportunities of digital technologies in industry for sustainability, but of course, also the risks of these technologies. And in the study that I'm going to present today, we were looking more closely into the question how digital technologies are used in supply chain, specifically the electronic supply chain, by international buying firms and Chinese suppliers to collaborate on sustainability. I'm an economist by training, and the research focus of our group is more on social sciences. So we are doing social science research about the technologies and how technologies are used in society, and thus, of course, are also put into new contexts that might, on the one hand, create possibilities for sustainability, but also risks. Now, the motivation for this study, More Sustainable Supply Chains Through Industry 4.0, that I'm presenting here is that we're hearing a lot about all these opportunities that arise through a digitalized supply chain for transparency in the supply chain, for better assessment of the sustainability of first tier, maybe second and third tier suppliers. So eventually an entirely digitalized supply chain is supposed to bring consciousness and ability to assess the environmental implications in terms of emissions, in terms of material use in the supply chain. So we wanted to speak to both sides. We concentrated on the first tier suppliers and the buying firms, and wanted to hear both sides' perspectives on whether digital technologies are actually already used in their specific context to monitor sustainability parameters, and how they view the possibilities and risks of these technologies in the future to contribute to sustainability of the supply chain. So our idea was to first concentrate solely on digital technologies used in supply chain collaboration. So to assess the firm's digital maturity that they already have in collaboration, and distinguish between 3 levels. I will talk a bit more about this in the next slide. And then ask, okay, now that we know a little bit more about how digital technologies are generally used, we can find out about the opportunities and risks and the obstacles that are related to digitalization for sustainable supply chain management and collaboration. So the first part was more on the side of how are digital technologies generally used, and the second part more on the environmental implications. And this should all contribute to an assessment of the governance options of digital technologies in the supply chain, as both on the policy and on the managerial level. I mentioned that we have talked, so what I haven't mentioned yet, we did an interview study, and we discussed with supply chain managers from Chinese suppliers, supplying firms and international buying firms, and why we use China, or we looked at China because China is an important player in the electronics value chain. So we deemed this relevant contribution to the discussion, especially in the electronics value chain. And another aspect that I would briefly like to mention before I go more into the details of the methodology is that that we found that the debate about digitalization in the supply chains is split between, on the one hand, and this is I would say a simplistic picture, but on the one hand, in the sustainable supply chain literature, more in the management studies, speaking about the specific technological hurdles that managers have in the companies to introduce, for instance, digital technologies for sustainable supply chain management. And on the other hand, more in the global value chains literature, where we talk about environmental upgrading and we talk about this governance perspective. But this is an aspect that I'm happy to discuss in the next minutes, if there are any opinions and maybe contradictory views on this. And another aspect that I already pointed to is this question of digital maturity in the supply chain and more specifically in our paper in the aspect of collaboration. And we developed this stylized categorization of digital maturity in collaboration, which speaks of 4 levels of digital maturity. So in the basic level, this rather common situation where really no digital technologies are used whatsoever. And then on the second level, a low digital maturity, which I think is more common even in the firms that we have interviewed. So only very basic digital technology use, like emails being sent or Excel tables being used to keep track of materials. And then on the third level, an intermediate digital maturity. For us, that meant that in the firms, we are already starting to see the use of Industry 4.0 technologies, or what is categorized as Industry 4.0. So mainly automated systems, cyber physical systems, the use of data analysis tools for large intentionally and unintentionally collected pools of data, the use of artificial intelligence, and so on. And then on the highest level would be the high digital maturity. So that would be a diffusion of Industry 4.0 technologies in the collaboration between companies. Now, the methodology that I was already pointing to that we used in the study were interviews, or it was an interview study, and we used qualitative content analysis to assess the contents of the interviews. Just to give you a brief overview, we talked about the supply chain processes and collaboration processes in general in the companies. And we then went over to ask what digital technologies are used and how they're used in the selection and collaboration with suppliers, as well as the specific role of big data analysis in supply chain collaboration. because we took this specific technology or this technology cluster as an exemplary technology and technological application in the context of Industry 4.0. And then the last aspect were the perceived and expected risks and opportunities that our interview partners saw of digital technologies in the supply chain. So what are the results? I will just briefly mention a few aspects. On the one hand, we try to have this broader view on digital technologies in general, and the aim of this approach was to first open the discussion with less sustainability centered focus to make our interview partners imagine what could be possible with the digital technologies that they are using. And this was also the reason why we didn't talk to the supply chain persons in the respective companies, but we didn't talk to the environmental managers in their respective companies, but we talked to supply chain managers that didn't have a focus on sustainability, as we wanted to explore the potentials of technologies that are used in supply chain management, but could have a potential benefit for the sustainability sphere. And so on this slide, you see that these technologies that we mention here are not focused on sustainability. So that was only the second step, to think about how could these existing enterprise resource planning systems, for instance, ERP systems, be used to assess energy use, material use in the supply chain. And maybe to go a bit quicker, another part of our results, as I mentioned, pointed to or was about the political and managerial implications. So as we noted, the sustainability aspect of digital technologies was not strongly developed in our discussions. What do I mean by this? When we started to talk about digital technologies, there was a large focus, of course, on efficiency in the supply chain and how digital technologies can help to make the or increase economic benefits. But at first glance, there were not a lot of mentions of the potential sustainability benefits and risks. So when we dive more deeper into the question, how could these systems, digital systems, be used for sustainability, there were a few suggested sustainability use cases that supply chain managers came up with, for instance, the gathering of sustainability data on online platforms that has started to be, or that they started to implement in some of the companies. And then aspects like the environmental optimization of the logistics chain through enhanced data collection in the supply chain, and then the analysis of this data through big data technologies. And another aspect that was sometimes mentioned was the improved material circularity that could be achieved through tracking and tracing of materials in the supply chain. And now, before I'm going to finish, we then set up two hypotheses in the paper that came out of the discussions with the supply chain managers. And one related to the aspect mentioned by some of the industry representatives, that the relationship between firms really depends on whether they collaborate through digital technologies or not. And this also led us to believe that maybe if we're thinking of this optimal digitally managed supply chain, we also need to ask for which companies is this really feasible, and how far do companies really need to have a more intense relationship to really create those interfaces that would enable them to, for instance, automatically exchange environmental data in their digital management systems. And the second aspect that I put here is what I already briefly touched upon. We didn't have the feeling in our interviews, and we didn't receive a lot of feedback on the question of whether digital technologies and sustainability are already interlinked in the companies. So a lot of the interview partners that we had said it's actually a good idea to think about the usefulness of digital technologies, but it's not a very prominent thought at the moment. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And then to close with, I would just briefly like to point out a few recommendations that we came up with. So I think one crucial aspect is the from the part of the buying firms, especially, to use digital technologies that fit into diverse countries' contexts, because we see varying digital maturities in the companies. And then if our system is too advanced in a way and doesn't match with local systems in some of the suppliers companies, then the digital transparency cannot be achieved. And another aspect, of course, is the economic benefits that digitalization can bring. These should be systematically linked to the environmental benefits. And for this to be feasible, we believe that an open, secure, and conducive environment has to be created by policy. But this is, of course, always a big challenge, and I'd be happy to discuss more. Thank you so much. Oops.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, for the presentation and the wrap up with some recommendation policy insights. We're going to hand over now to Frida Lager for a discussion of around 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, super interesting to hear, Stephanie. Also really good to read your paper on this. I don't work with digitalization at all, so my questions might be a little bit from we're focused on a lot of risk in supply chains and kind of the climate risk end of things. So my lens is somewhere there. So I'm just like, maybe just to start with, just interested to hear a little bit more about this kind of, because in the paper, transparency was mentioned a lot in kind of the interview setting, and since it's supply chains in China, and this kind of aspect of, from what I understood from reading your paper, that like digitalization tools are used in the kind of extent to which they provide economic benefit for a firm, for example, and can be implementable, for example. But I'm wondering about, because when it comes to introducing policy and kind of environmental sustainability, working with supply chains, we know that it's often a problem that, like, transparency is not something that companies necessarily are super happy about. I was wondering if you had any reflections doing this research and these interviews on kind of the transparency issue, or like if they were positive or reluctant and engaging in sustainability issues within the supply chains, or like kind of what was your feeling?
Thanks. I think, yeah, I mean, it's an exploratory study, I have to say, so it's difficult to generalize here. But one aspect that we did observe was that some of the Chinese suppliers sounded quite enthusiastic about the possibility to have more transparent supply chains. And they also mentioned that, or we got the feeling, but again, it's not a quantitative study, so I cannot generalize here, but that the Chinese interview partners were more open to the introduction of big data technologies in general, and to involving second tier suppliers into this analysis, also to again create this economic benefit. So in the argumentation, I think the key aspect often was, if we manage, let's say, if we have a system that is able to control our suppliers' energy use in the firm, and we can observe what how energy use goes up and down, like in real time, that's really beneficial to us, because we can help them save energy, and this will reduce the prices. But this is also what I talked about, or what I mentioned in the context of relationships. So this engagement in the suppliers' energy management system, which was mentioned, for instance, by one bigger buying firm, is also something you would only do if you have a continuous relationship with the supplier. So I think the options here to really integrate, let's say, energy management of the supplier into your own energy management, because it's the energy management of the entire supply chain, is limited, but that was seen as a benefit, because it also creates this these potential savings in terms of cost of the production of inputs. I don't know, it's a bit of a lengthy answer, but
it's great. It was also quite a unspecific question. So, and I have actually another just unspecific question as a second one. I'm wondering what you were most surprised about during, or if anything surprised you maybe during these interviews, like type of results that you didn't expect to get, or things that were contradictory to what you had expect going into it.
Maybe. I guess I'm missing some of the surprising things right now, but one aspect that really caught my attention was the rather positive view on, as the aspect or the example I was mentioning, the example of monitoring energy use in the firm, and how it would enable companies to see when energy use is going down, in terms of, or it was mentioned in the context of, I know when the employees in the supplier in the supplier's firm are going to have their breakfast break, and if in really in the sense of surveilling the employees, if they're taking too long for the breakfast break, then I'll see it in the energy data, and I can go to my supplier and say, okay, obviously you have a problem with the breakfast break, and this was somehow framed in a very positive context. But I think from a social point of view, I mean, it's good might be good for the reduction of energy use, if we're not taking into account the possible rebound effect. But then there comes this surveillance aspect into it, and that caught me in surprise, I would say.
Super interesting. I'm guessing, Silvan, I see some comments.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up. Maybe we can take one question. Thanks a lot, Frida. So I'm seeing there is one question from Stefan Söring, and he's also here. So I don't know if you're listening, you might could pose it yourself. If not, I'll read it out.
Yeah, I can talk myself. That's fine.
Okay.
Thanks, Stephanie, for the interesting presentation. I'm rather coming on your interpretations to keep it short. And I find it, first of all, I find the research gap that you address really relevant. I think that's not too much a research area. I was not fully clear on whether you rather take a management or an economics perspective. That is a bit of an issue in your positioning, and maybe just a hint. And last but not least, then let's rather go to a detail. In your hypothesis, you have the relationship first, and then the digital technologies, and then the outcomes. While I would rather see, quite often now we see that the technologies are applied, and then the impact on the relationship. So what's your take on this one? That would be my question. just to make it short.
Thanks, Stefan. That's a relevant question, and I believe I put it this, or we put it this way because the relation was there first. No, I mean, before there was use of digital technologies in supply chain, the partners had, or some companies had already collaborated with each other, and of course there's new relationships being established because of the digital technology. So that's another aspect that was also mentioned in the interviews. We can have many more relationships now with the efficiency that digital technologies bring into the supply chain. But I think for some of the partners, it was more like we're not already that we don't have such a digital supply chain at the moment, but together with our partners, we can develop this, and this will be very beneficial to both of us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie and Stefan. There are, I think, at least one more question directly in the chat. Stephanie, if you like, you can address it right there. Unfortunately, we have to move on. Thanks a lot. So now we have another presentation more in the area of mega trends regarding to digitalization on blockchain and global value chains. This one is by Bernhard Tröster. I saw Bernhard already put up the presentation. Great. So Bernhard, the floor is yours.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to present my research. And so my name is Bernhard Tröster. I'm working for the Austrian Foundation for International Development in Vienna. And we are applying global value chain analysis or global production network analysis. And my work is pretty much focused on commodity global value chain. And I was curious actually about how blockchains actually work. And because there's much talk about these applications also in commodity global value chains. So I applied this idea and how this is actually working out, and what are the obstacles, especially when it's linked to governance issues in global value chains. So obviously global value chains, and in particular commodity global value chains, are very much known for problematic production practices when it comes to economic, but also ecological and social sustainability. And so blockchain technologies have been thrown into the ring as a tool to overcome then these problematic production practices, because of their increasing transparency and traceability. And so my contribution is actually that I look at the basics of this blockchain and how this technology is applied in the global value chains. And then I identify then the limits and opportunities of this application when it comes to the technical challenges. This also somewhat relates to the digital maturity, and also then when it comes to the global value chain governance. Methodologies shortly, it's not part of a bigger research project, so I use secondary literature research and also look at case studies for coffee and minerals. I quickly go through this. I mean, there is an increasing awareness also among consumers because of better information and campaigns from NGOs and medias, etc., on the practices in commodities. You can name them from coffee to cocoa to also mining activities. And so there have been responses to it, and there's like a level of trust, or something like a concept with regard to the consumers. So consumers can take statements from producers, but they can also rely on branding or corporate social responsibility activities. But that was not sufficient, and so pretty much the certification and verification schemes developed, but these approaches have also limits, and one limit that was identified is the dependency on third parties. So you still have to rely on a certifier or a third party who controls then the verification schemes. And so the idea is that you overcome this with this blockchain technology, and then have an even know-how or somewhat personal control also from the consumer side, because he or she can then control where the products have come from, how they have been produced or changed or traded. So the idea that also comes from the theoretical point of view in global value chain is pretty much that there is obviously also corporate action now by lead firms with regard to this sustainability issue. And it's Stefano Ponte who raises the idea that lead firms actually undertake sustainability management. This is pretty much then strategic actions that these lead firms take in relations to sustainability issues, and that allows them to continue capital accumulation, as he says it. And he puts even this sustainability management next to the other drivers of capital dynamics, which are typically in the global production network analysis: cost, flexibility, and speed. And so if you take these four factors in, these are then the drivers or the explanatory variables why existing spatial and organization and technology solutions are there, and which actually allow for continuous capital accumulation by lead firms. And what Stefano Ponte is also pointing out is that there are very much problems that come along with sustainability issues, mainly that there's a sustainability-driven supplier cost squeeze. So the producers in the upstream actually have to carry the costs of sustainability or initiatives, something like verification or certification. And so, and in addition, there's limited impact on sustainability, and there are many examples where it can really show this. And so the blockchain could be then a solution, but it could be also a tool in this to be part of the sustainability management. What he also raises is that it's this corporate sustainability management efforts, they are also a part of broader sustainability governance. And this sustainability governance, it also includes other actions by public sector or by NGOs, or and so it's like all different actors that really engaged in sustainability issues. And what is then, in addition for my work, I thought of, or I included what also Stefano Ponte is doing, that he includes then work by Dallas on different types of power and how they actually affect then sustainability governance. And what you can see is that actually that there are these different types of powers, actually different in various commodity global value chain. And we see this for the examples of coffee and minerals. So basically, on the blockchain technologies, to cut it short, it's the main idea that you get also from its application in Bitcoins, etc., is that it's a distributed ledger system. So everything like the creation, validation, recording, storing, sharing of information is actually possible without a third party. And which makes it that every participant in the value chain is actually is then the third party who contributes to this basic system. So you need some key elements to have a blockchain application. You have this distributed nature of records, so it's not stored on a central storage device. You need a cryptographic mechanism in order to keep then the records immutable, and you need a kind of consensus mechanism, which is important when you enter new information into the blockchain. How do the different actors actually agree on if it's valid, and because once it's recorded, it should be immutable. So it's important how this updating is actually done. And you have in theory, you have very different kind of configurations. You can do blockchains for actors that don't know each other. So you have to take much more effort to include on consensus mechanisms and cryptographics. But you can also add like who is able to write and commit information and who is the ones who really update it. What it comes to, then the design of such blockchains actually then depend on the purpose and the technical factors. But how is then this actually applied in for global value chains? So what I would describe it that it's basically a layer upon the physical structure of the supply chain or value chain. So it is basically a closed, private, and permissioned distributed ledger system or blockchain system. So the people already know each other. So it's an existing value chain or supply chain, but the information that is linked to this supply chain is then transferred to a digital layer. What is actually problematic from a technical point of view, or challenging, I would say, is this onboarding risk. So you need to ensure that the people who are actually entering that information on the digital level, that this information is actually true in reality. So if they are putting information on how they produce and how sustainable their production is, then this still has to be somewhat linked to the reality and checked if that's really true. And there are also onboarding risks when it comes to smallholders who might have not the digital or technical abilities to enter this. And the other point is when it comes to governance issues and what information are actually collected and who has access to this information. And what we can see is that there's much talk about this application, but not that many existing examples. But there are some in coffee, and what I looked at is Farmers Connect. It's an application which is developed by the lead firms, which are major roasters. This JDE and Suckers, but also coffee traders are involved. This is Volcom and Zuckerfina, who all four are in the top 5 of the segments in the coffee value chain. And what they do is that they build up a website, and they have a QR code where the people who buy this coffee can check then the origin of this coffee, but it's only limited to Colombian coffee that's coming from Colombian cooperatives. And you can check for the transport routes and where it has been roasted. Additional feature is that customer can receive additional information, and they can also donate then to the producers or producer cooperatives. But what is important here is that it's like an application to a very limited value chain. So the Colombian coffee sector is pretty much known for its high organization level. It's on a cooperative level. They also have a high level of certified coffee. So it's actually documenting something that is already a sustainable value chain, as I would declare it. Then there's also another example for an application that was developed by GIZ. And so what it documents is actually coffee that is made by the Women's Coffee Corporation in Rwanda. Again, you can, it's distributed through an online specialty coffee shop in Germany, and you can then use then the application, and the customer can use then see the information where it was coming from. But this application in the coffee value chain are actually positioned like this, that they are very selective, and they document already established and certified coffee value chain, or even specialty coffee chain. And they don't really have an impact on economic sustainability, and they are related to actually value chains that have been verified or certified actually by the common certification schemes.
I just want to ask, maybe you can wrap up in the next 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure. No problem. Then the other example that I looked at is minerals. So what you can see there is that the context is something different. So you have a regulatory context, and context meaning that you have due diligence policy in place or coming up. So there is actually an urge for the actors in the value chain that they have to verify and trace their supplies. So there are plans for applications where major auto manufacturers like Tesla, but also Ford or something, they cooperate and with the major miner companies. And so it's basically, again, then this large scale mining miners that actually then ensure productivity standards, and then you can do the traceability issue. And there are plans also for applications for artisanal mining, but it's very then harder for this onboarding problem. So my conclusions is basically that it is an interesting approach. They can increase transparency and traceability, but for now they are only documenting underlying physical value chain. And the ones that they are documenting is that where are they already established, where there are already established sustainable value chain. And the problem is that I see that pretty much the governance in value chains with a weak institutional power, so with no institutional setup to include sustainability, like in coffee, that it can be used by the lead firms, and that they also extract then much more data, and it's used for a marketing reason. In other sectors, such as the mining, where you have a strong institutional power and regulatory pressure, then these two can be a part where you can expand sustainable production. But still, like the applications and the solutions that should come up, actually, they have to somewhat overcome then the sustainability-driven cost squeeze. So you need also information on prices, which is not currently part of the project, and it should somewhat engage sustainable production and also empower smallholders, which might not have the digital maturity and abilities currently to really be part of the chain solutions. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bernhard, on this interesting talk on one side the possibilities, but also the limitations of blockchain use in the sustainability of value chains. I hand over to Stephanie, who will make the discussion on this one.
Thank you, Stefan. And thank you, Bernhard, for the presentation. When I read your paper, I was wondering if during your research, you sometimes had the feeling, I don't want to be too presumptive here, that blockchain is a bit like the techno fixes that we know from the past, or if you were rather in a positive mood and said, this actually sounds like a really good idea that can bring us forward in supply chain sustainability. So maybe a personal view on what is the likely outcome of this.
I have a mixed impression. So it depends on the value chain that you look at. So if you look for the applications now for coffee, I have the impression that the examples that exist now, they are basically set up on the already existing relatively sustainable value chain. So the example that I showed is like for the Colombian value chain. The Colombian coffee sector is pretty much organized. It has a centralized organization building on cooperatives, and it's highly certified already. So the additional information that you get out of the value chain is not too much. It's rather seems like a marketing tool or gadget. Also for even if you go for the sustainable or this specialty coffees, then it's also the same case. So it's not an additional, it doesn't bring benefits to actually the producer. And the big issue in the coffee sector and why there are problems on sustainability is that coffee is pretty much grown by smallholders, especially when you go to sub-Saharan Africa, where we did much of our research, it's like it's very small, yeah, garden coffee arrangements, and so it's very important as a cash crop, but it's somewhat there. It's much more informal and etc. And to bring on such issues onto a digital level is almost, I don't know if that's really a solution, and that's why it's not the technical tools to then target then the problems there. But the other example that I would stress is then in the mineral sector, where you have these due diligence processes and you have like supply chain laws, etc. So there is a need for traceability, and it's also coming from the industry itself. So the OEMs, the automobile companies, they are forwarding this because they want to have like traceable and sustainable produced copper and cobalt, etc. So they are aware of the risk that comes with these problematic production practices, and there it could be a solution. But again, what is then generally the other problem is it's a digital layer on the reality, and the reality has to show that it is sustainable. Yeah, and if it's not sustainable, then you can't bring it through the value chain in the current setup.
It's true, and it also links to some of the questions here in the chat. I see about the certification problem. So so one question was, can you give one example how this would work without a certifier? Like how do we make sure that the reality really reflects this certified product or the information that we give into the blockchain? But I would quickly wanted to ask Silvan, do we have time for another discussion or another question, or should we leave this to the chat?
I mean, you just nicely raised this question. I don't know if this is already addressed. I think then you can go ahead with one more question, then we will close. If not, I would like to take up this certification problem question if this is not yet fully addressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Stefan also asked if blockchains are the right instrument and who governs the blockchains. I think one interesting aspect I found you wrote about was the way how you verify the information in the chain. So this consensus mechanism and how practically feasible it is for all the actors in the supply chain to verify the information. And then you also wrote about so-called food trust platforms that serve as trust anchors. So eventually, I think this also links us to the question of power in the supply, or power distribution in the supply chain. If we again have this authority, then in this case the trust anchor that has to verify the information, I think the idea of this consensus mechanism gets lost a little bit, and of this peer certification.
Yeah. So quickly on this certification problem. So the thing is that it doesn't really, blockchains don't work without certification or other technical instruments. So it's also in the paper, there are also, again, different technical solutions how to identify the people that actually contribute then their materials into a supply chain, for instance, when it comes to artisanal mining. So it's like there are a lot of projects from GIZ to make tags and QR codes, etc. So it still needs some effort to link this thing, and it's again most of the answers are in the technology base. And the other thing is like these blockchain solutions, they are pretty much all private blockchains, and the governance is then made up. And who develops then these ones? It's pretty much then, I suggest that it's the lead firms again that set them up, and because of the limitations of this of especially smallholders to participate in this digital solutions, and then the verification again is made by the large players. And so it's not really something like a consensus, but it's smallholders are the ones in the upstream sector actually contribute and they also contribute their data, but they don't have access or cannot use this data. Whereas the lead firms, yeah, they have a pretty much an interest into to get these data also and potentially use them. But it's that still should be probably also be verified with the ones who develop them. But it's again a problem that the applications are scarce for the moment, and there are not many really. It's much more about talks and plans and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot, Stephanie and Bernhard, and I'm sure you can take the discussion to the chat. I think there's still some interest there. So now moving on for our last presentation by Frida Lager, we move away from digitalization more to another mega trend, if we even should call it that. It's climate risk or climate change. And so Frida, the floor is yours.
Let's see if this works. Thank you. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. I'm working on only one screen today about apropos digitalization. It's very unusual for me. So let's see if that works. So
we can see, yeah, it works.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I'm Frida Lager, and I'm a research associate at Stockholm Environment Institute, and I'm here presenting on behalf of both me and my colleague Magnus today. And as Sylvain said, it'll be on a slightly different topic, or quite a lot of a different topic, looking beyond the horizon and trying to assess systemic climate risk to build resilience in global value chains. So yeah, I'll be just going through with you some like setting the scene kind of for the kind of topic that we work on, which is climate risk in trade systems, and then some examples of research that we've developed to try and address and assess these types of risk, and kind of what the options for actions are in that space. And yeah, looking forward to discuss that with you. So stepping right into it, really, climate change is happening. Not a surprise to anyone these days, I think. This past summer can be seen as a teaser of what's to come in the decades ahead. We've seen flooding events affecting large parts of Europe, wildfires in both North and South America, showing just how a changing climate can cause disruption that spread across countries and continents. This has also been a really clear message from the ongoing pandemic, that we live in a really truly interconnected world, where our lives and livelihoods are increasingly interdependent on one another across the globe. And so just like the virus, the impacts of climate change can spread between countries, over continents, or have systemic effects on the global world markets. They can do so via international supply chains, investments, the movement of people, or shared ecosystems and resources. And in turn, also responses, adaptation responses, or supply chain adaptations to these climate risks can have impacts way beyond the place where they are actually intended to. So just to take an example, the food price crisis of 2007 and 2008 is quite a clear one, where really multiple factors, including rising oil prices, extreme weather events, changes in food demand, trade policies, and government responses to the unfolding crisis, such as export bans, all really interacted to generate a surge in global food prices, creating food insecurity for vulnerable people worldwide. And another different but very recent example is the current global lack of computer chips that is caused by COVID, a surge in demand globally, storms in Texas, fires in Japan, droughts in Vietnam, and challenges in shipping logistics. And also here, multiple factors cause disruption in a small but crucial part of a global supply chain that really have really dire effects for wide sectors of the global economy, and will take a long time to recover from. So to start to address these issues of transboundary, cross-border, or systemic climate risk that often have vague, unclear, or difficult or undefined governance systems, we founded something that we call Adaptation Without Borders. It's funded by three partners: Stockholm Environment Institute, IDRI, which is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and the Overseas Development Institute. It's a global partnership working to strengthening systemic resilience And we do so by kind of creating visibility, gather evidence, which is this kind of presentation is some sort of example of, but also building connection and inspire action really on this field. So as I said, examples. To start, sorry. So as awareness of these interconnected climate risk is rising, especially with COVID, policymakers are increasingly acknowledge the significance of cross-border or transboundary climate risk or supply chain risk in general, but we still know really too little. We have a really poor understanding of where transboundary climate risk originates, how they travel, and who is exposed. And the few studies that have been made to date have been kind of niche, country or sector specific and or qualitative. We work a lot with kind of adaptation, climate adaptation governance sphere, and in adaptation plans in virtually all countries, as well as targeted adaptation finance. Although they overwhelmingly fail to identify or assess transboundary climate risk. So I'll show you an example of how we attempt to address this. And this report, which is cited in the very bottom here, is really a first attempt to take a systematic approach on climate change risk in global food systems. And so we've done so by looking at 6 of the world's most traded commodities: rice, wheat, soy, maize, sugarcane, and coffee. And so really short on methods, what we did is take really state-of-the-art trade data, really granular data, looking at 141 consuming countries and the embedded trade of commodities. We related that to countries' import dependency of these crops, so imports in relation to domestic production and how diverse those import sources are. And then we combined this data with predicted changes in yields for our 6 crops up until the year 2100, using the representative concentration pathways of the RCP 8.5, which is the most likely trajectory right now if we continue with business as usual. And this graph shows the predicted global, so this is the general results of the study, basically. The graph shows the predicted global average changes in yields for each crop that we've looked at. So for 5 out of 6 crops, our models show a decrease in yields globally. The most dramatic decrease of global supplies is in the sugarcane, coffee and maize production systems. Wheat is the only crop that show an average increase, mostly because it's largely grown in the Northern Hemisphere, and production increase is predicted in France, Ukraine, and other countries in Eastern Europe due to temperature rise, basically. And these are the global averages, and the risk looks really different in a country-to-country perspective, as some producers report increases while others have decreases in yield at the same time. So, for example, even though the global average wheat market show an increase, the supplies of wheat from the US, for example, is reporting a decline, and results in countries in Latin America and Africa that are highly dependent on US wheat, such as Nigeria, leaving them really vulnerable, despite that the overall wheat market has an increase globally. So our results indicate that climate risk to global food security are disproportionately transmitted from quite a small number of countries, really. So the major risk exporters are Brazil, China, and the US for the export of maize, Thailand and the US for the exports of rice, and the US again, as mentioned, for wheat. And these countries show up as global risk exporters because they're major global suppliers of these crops, and because the decrease in yield are expected to be most severe in these countries, but also because many importing countries are highly dependent on supplies from these specific exporting countries. Just to give you another example, Jamaican imports of maize is close to 90% from the US. So that's a really risky bilateral relationship. So the exposure look different for staple food crops such as maize, rice, and wheat than they do for highly embedded commodities such as soy or sugarcane. And this is because embedded commodities are part of much more complex supply chains. Soy, for example, which is worldwide predominantly used as cattle feed, would be included in Swedish produced sausages containing Danish pork, for example, that is then fed by Brazilian soy. And that would form a part of the whole kind of Swedish exposure on the soy market. And we'll come back to soy just in a little while. For these highly embedded products, risk exposure is more dispersed and come from many countries, and together these risks pose a more indirect threat to food security than rice, wheat, and maize, for example, by threatening to really drive price increases and shocks across a basket of products instead of specific staples. So I'm not going to exhaust you with a lot of results from this study, but this is just to show you how one of the crops look like. This is the image, or this image is the result of the main exporters and importers of the global rice markets. And so for rice, risky bilateral trade relationships originate primarily in Thailand and the US. And Thailand trades with a broad array of countries, including small islands in the region such as Brunei, with African states like Senegal and Ghana, many European countries, including Norway, for example. And the US is shown to be a key source of risk for Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico. Here's just the rest of the list. Keeping to rice just for a little while, this map shows the overall risk in the rice markets from climate change, where you can clearly see Thailand and the US dominating the scene. I wanted to show you this because the table to the right also gives a hint of the relation between size and risk exposure, where China and India, for example, are by volume similarly important exporters on the right market as Thailand, but are predicted to be much less affected by declining yields. And so they have a lesser degree, and also they have a lesser degree of countries highly dependent on them, the rice supply. And so they show up as much less risky suppliers in these results. So just to be clear about the results here, according to predictions, Russia could probably benefit in the rice sector, according to and also North Korea, possibly, from the data that we have on kind of future yield projections. So I'm going to leave that study behind and just talk to you quite quickly, just mention another study that we've done on kind of climate risk and supply chains. This one is focused on Swedish imports or Swedish consumption of embedded soy from Brazil. Brazil is one of the main source, or it is the main import partner for EU when it comes to soy supply. And so we've been just looking specifically at this supply chain and just see how granular we can get in understanding climate risk in the supply chain, basically. So looking at Brazilian soy, we identified two key risk areas. One is the production of soy, how yields are predicted to be to change, but also looking at acute drought risk in Brazil, and the second part is that we looked at transport risk in inland roads in Brazil, transporting soy from farm to port, just to see, and this is also, it's a lot of the work we do right now is a lot of method innovation to try and understand climate risk and supply chains, and kind of from a national perspective, how can it be addressed? So I'm just really going to quickly show you some of the results from this study, and just looking at the granularity of data, which has been really important for this study, that we found both climate risk data, or kind of, climate impact data, and production data on municipality level scale in Brazil, and could also track from which ports Brazilian soy leaves the harbors to go to Europe for the consumption of soy here, and kind of got a really good image of what the Swedish exposure in the supply chain looked like. This is kind of the overall results of these risks for Sweden specifically, and this is not true for the rest of Europe, but Sweden and Norway specifically sourced from this one region, which is called C here, kind of Mato Grosso and around, which has quite a low climate risk when it comes to production, but high to medium high when it comes to transport. So that was interesting to see, because often transport is not at all assessed in these type of risk assessments. I think I'm running out of time, but this is my last slide, and I just wanted to say something briefly about different types of approaches when it comes to acting in this space. What do you do with this type of information, basically? So from kind of a country perspective, we work a lot with like adaptation from a country on a country level. Country that is exposed to kind of trade-related climate risk could have kind of these 5 options for actions. Not to say that not saying that I'm not saying that anyone is better than the other, but they have they have some limitations and potentialities across these 5. So a country that is exposed to trade-related climate risk could obviously do some homework, reduce their own dependency, increase for domestic production, which obviously has its cost and limitations when it comes to actually reducing climate risk. You can shop elsewhere, so substitute climate risk suppliers for others, which doesn't solve the problem of systemic risk. Also, recent research show that a lot of supply chains are more sticky than we often have thought them to be. There's also really important justice implications in this approach, where you can wonder if this is really one way, if this is really the way we should act in global markets, to just leave really vulnerable and exposed regions to fend for themselves in the future. There's also an option to invest in resilience abroad, where climate risk is high, to cooperate to manage the market within international and regional bodies such as the EU or the African Union, etc., and work with solidarity, or lastly, just let market forces autonomously adapt to these challenges. So that's all for me.
Thanks a lot, Frida. That was right on time, so no worries there. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation on this climate future yield projection. I also liked how the data was presented, and I think that's always important to get the message across. I'll hand over to Bernhard, who will be the discussant for this.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I have to agree. It's a great visualization that you have, also in the presentation in the reports itself. And one thing that was very good, I guess, and it's a very important point to raise, is actually that this climate policies should not be stick within the national borders, but it's rather a global issue because of this interconnections with trade, and probably then also related to foreign direct investment, etc. So it's not a national problem, it's a global problem, and you emphasize that very clearly. However, if you then, and you didn't talk about it because it's probably also a technical issue, if you want to really look at it from the data perspective, then you also emphasize in the especially in the paper on Sweden, that what are the limitations of like cross trading data, and that you have to look at input output data, but also like what are the material footprints and water footprints, etc. And I guess there's still like much more potential to include these issues in the data. But you actually showed this for the case of Sweden, and I guess the larger study on food security, it was rather straightforward what the climate risk is on. But I was wondering what you refer to the climate risk in the case of Sweden. So what's the risk then? Is it for, I don't know, economic growth in Sweden? Is it just that it's the risk for supply or import patterns as they are now? So I did not really understand what you refer the climate risk on. And I guess what is also an issue is that the sectoral details, I mean, in the food security, it's quite clear and you have this clear case, but in the case of Sweden, also then agricultural sector and also agricultural trade, it's important for food security and it's obviously an important issue, but as a whole, on the macroeconomic level, it's probably something different. And I mean, you mentioned some other sectors where you looked at risk in supply chains, but it's yeah. I was wondering if it's like worth it to go for like the whole other, include also other sector, or include a whole economy to address this climate risk. And then I was wondering a very specific question, because you had in the paper on food security, you had the outcome that maize, the production decreases, and the one for wheat actually could increase because of shifts from one country producing it now to other, probably more northern countries. And that's not the case for other agricultural goods, meaning that they can be then produced in other countries because of climate change. I was wondering why there's such a large difference in the grains. Thanks.
Let's see. Thank you, Bernhard. I'll try to remember what you asked. You're gonna remind me if I missed something. Maybe to answer your last question first, because it's a little bit more, it's a little bit easier to answer, I think, and a little more technical. So we are not looking at potential. So there's like some limitations with the methodology in a way, because we have to, in the end, we have to kind of limits the scope of the research, because there are so many interconnected systems and drivers and also like a lot of these kind of more socioeconomic or land use change issues that we just can't address, because it's like in this specific, or we don't address it in the specific methodology, just because it will make it too big in a way. So we are actually looking at the only on current production systems. So we have some. I know that there are other people working with, okay, what's the future land use, trying to model future potential land use, and I mean it might be possible that we can expand the rice cultivation areas to other areas than what it's now used, right? And wheat is kind of grown in very many different parts of the world, whereas soy is kind of confined to areas in the global south. Rice and it's like both cultural reasons, right, and production reasons for this. We know like the only kind of exception to this, or one of the key exceptions to it, is coffee, where we have regions in the world where it needs to be, you have to have a certain altitude and certain conditions have to be met. So with coffee, we know that like we can't expand the regions unless something radical happens to the coffee plants, right? Some innovation there. We can't expand the region much, so we actually are confined to the regions where we are now growing coffee. So that's quite clear that like, yeah, there might be changes in the other production areas, but for coffee, it's very confined. And also, it's not really I don't think that's not what we're trying to do with this. I think that in the future, all of these components, and there are other drivers or other components that are really key to also lift in. Transport is not considered, for example, in this global food risk report, which would be one of the key things to also address. And there are a lot of other things that it's more about like how, for us right now, it's more about like if we innovate, like if we really think about an approach to try and start to tackle kind of systemic risk on a global scale to the food sector, then what could that look like? So that's why we've kind of, and that's complex enough for us to kind of get across to policymakers right now. Like, why do you need to care about this? Why is it in our interest to care about adaptation in other parts of the world? For example, from a European perspective. So that's where we're at right now. And I think the other what I showed you, like the soy supply chain and Swedish exposure is another version of that, where we try to take more factors into account, but we also notice then that we kind of we overreach in a way. We are much further along than where the policymakers can actually follow us. They're not interested in that many details yet of this. So that's also why we stopped there right now, because we're trying to work with both kind of what does this mean in a governance perspective, as well as doing the kind of methodological kind of landwinnings with it. And I'm sorry, now I lost the first question, and maybe
the first one was what is to what factors do you refer then the climate risk when it comes to Sweden?
Right, yeah, and sectors and stuff. Yeah, it's a great question. I think partly in the Swedish case study, like we didn't want to. There are ways, like from a Swedish perspective, like Sweden. I mean, it's also political. Like, what do you see as a risk? What do you see as a climate risk, or like also where do you pose as kind of a climate like opportunities when it comes to climate change? And I mean, food it's easier because it's clear, like we need food and water or whatever. When it comes to Sweden, we're super import and export dependent when it comes to Swedish jobs, for example. So that's really like it's in a way that social organization, social security, that could also have like also focus on that as a kind of climate risk perspective. Energy security is also one that is really key. And I think it's going to be coming up more and more in this kind of field. Also on a kind of from a policy space is catching attention. So I think the very overall, when we're looking at land and water use and kind of matching that with climate vulnerability in source countries, it was just to get an overview of like how can we address if we try and address kind of limitations of the data that exist, but still want to get a grasp of like what kind of sectors might be more or less exposed to risk in any way in their supply chains or in the way that things are sourced. Then like, do we see general trends? And then I think for each sector we need to go, like we have done some to some degree with agricultural sector or food sector, to look at the specific sectors kind of challenges when it comes to trade-related climate risk. But from a adaptation, when Sweden is now next year starting to revise their adaptation strategy on a national level, I think it's helpful to still get an overview of like different, how can you start addressing this, or how can you think about different sectors being exposed in different ways to climate risk, from a way that is not keeping in mind that normally a country like Sweden only looks within the country's own borders to try and understand what climate adaptation or climate risk is. And so it's this attempt to broaden that perspective in a way that is not too overwhelming at first. In a way, I hope that's an answer to the question. Yeah.
No, thanks. I understood it, that it's like a very broad field, and you can only pick out some parts of it. I mean, there's also this very much interrelations that are still valuable to look into. Also, the interrelation in the other way around, because trade flows obviously also impact on climate change and the other way, but I understand that it's like a very complex issue and you can only use part of it, and then step by step you can enter into this other issues.
So unfortunately we have to stop here. I'll let this run a bit longer because we have no direct question from the audience, but yeah, thanks a lot, Frida, for the presentation. Thanks, Bernhard, for having a lively discussion on this one. And yeah, thanks again, Stephanie, for your presentation as well. Maybe a bit on the logistics for the rest of the day. So there will be a half an hour break. Now it's a little bit less, but there is also this option to join Wonder.me. I think you got an email with to have a discussion there during the break. And then at 2:45, there will be 3 sessions to choose from. So I hope to see some of you later throughout the day. And yeah, thanks a lot for the active participation. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.